Welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast, the podcast that explores the issues, stories, and people that have shaped places into what they are today. Here's your host, Adam Kamek.
If you're interested in starting a podcast, then Podcaster's Paradise is an invaluable resource for you. With step-by-step video tutorials, a tremendous number of resources and templates, and daily support, Podcaster's Paradise is by far the most important resource for any aspiring podcaster. Plus, if you join Podcaster's Paradise through my link, then I will promote your podcast on the show. Check out Podcaster's Paradise at placesandprofiles.com/paradise. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Matt Briney about the life and legacy of President Theodore Roosevelt. Matt is the Chief Communications Officer at the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library, which is scheduled to open during the summer of 2026. Matt previously worked at George Washington's Mount Vernon as Vice President of Communications. You can find the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library at trlibrary.com. Links to social media accounts for the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library can be found via links at that website. For more information, please check out the show notes page for today's episode at placesandprofiles.com/27. Matt, welcome to the show.
Adam, it's great to be with you.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. So I want to start with your own interest in Theodore Roosevelt. When we were talking prior to beginning the recording, you mentioned that he is one of your favorite presidents. So why is he one of your favorite presidents, and why have you developed this interest in Theodore Roosevelt over the years?
I think Theodore Roosevelt is one that a politician, a statesman, an adventurer that I think a lot of us can relate to, even in today's modern. He's known as the first modern president. And I think a lot of the issues that he tackled during his time are ones that are relative in today's world. And I think the way that his leadership, where he crossed boundaries, he did what was right. He wanted to be a good citizen. He wanted to be protect the rights of a common man. I mean, these are values that I think are ones that all Americans should really cherish. And it'd be great to see a little bit more of that in Washington today.
All right, so let's dive into Theodore Roosevelt's life story. And I do want to get to much of what you just touched on with him being the first modern president and his interest in protecting the rights of the common man. But let's go back to the period of time before he was president. So he has a background as a writer, as a historian. He rises up through New York politics. What information is relevant to know about his early life, his family background, his early political career, the things that precede him starting to get some of the higher profile positions that he comes into towards the end of the 1890s up until he becomes president?
Yeah, sure. So he grows up in New York, and he's part of a wealthy family. His father was a wealthy businessman who also then was a very charitable individual. So this is something that he's seen through his life. During his time, he watched when he was little. There's a great photograph of him overlooking the casket of Abraham Lincoln, and he sees this, and it's kind of a vast transformation, I think, in the way that he looks at things. He goes into politics. He was elected to the New York Assembly after going to Harvard, and he was kind of known to be a little bit of a different type of person. New York politics at the time, I think, was very, very corrupt, very, kind of backroom deals and things like that. And that's just not him. And I think that you start to see that in some of the legislation that he advocates for. And I think that it really is the start of his ultimate career, and one that I think lays kind of the foundation for who he is.
So can you go into a little more detail about how he was a different type of person, just how different he was from most of the other people who were in New York politics at this time, and how he was able to use his different persona, his different personality, his different outlook and worldview to his benefit to allow him to rise up the ranks within New York politics?
Yeah, so he buckles a lot of kind of tradition. A lot of people were kind of expecting him to stick to his class, to be someone that would help support, the barons of New York and prosper from that. But really, he's kind of he makes a little bit of a change, and I think he blocked a corrupt group effort by Jay Gould to lower his taxes. That's one of kind of his big main marks there. And I think that you see him kind of continue anti-corruption efforts, and ultimately that helps him win re-election in 1882 by a margin greater than 2-1, which I think is, it sets him up. It sets him to be the sites of kind of larger efforts, and ultimately become the vice president. And so this is just the start of his efforts. He was he aligned very closely with the Grover Cleveland, the passage of a civil service reform bill, and eventually he sought the office of the speaker. So he was really get into the arena and go, right. And I think he really, what you also see in this time of his life is the use of media, right. He would utilize it to raise his own political profile in New York publications, and to be able to tell these stories. And so I think that this is really where he's learning to become a great statesman.
Now, you mentioned that there was this expectation upon his entering politics that he stick to his class. Can you talk a little bit about what that looked like in that era? Obviously, he deviated from that and he did not stick to his class, as you just explained. But can you talk about kind of what some of those class distinctions were and what someone might have expected from him based on the class distinctions that existed at that time?
Yeah, today we think about those big people that are millionaires, are Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos. That all pales in comparison to what you saw during his time. James Gould being one of them, but all these robber barons of kind of the New York and really nationally. And these are they're big families. They've grown up and they've captured wealth, right? But they've done it on the backs of the common working man. There's a large effort that Theodore Roosevelt really gets interested in kind of the tenements of New York, and tenement projects where people are just living in deplorable conditions. Sometimes, their families, their children are working within these places, and it's really, it's not a great living conditions, let alone working conditions, right? And there's multiple people to houses. The houses are all run down. So these are things that kind of inspire him to go and fight. There's a big effort to essentially capture photography and new inventions that utilize this and flash photography that enables you to capture really dark spaces. And this gets published, and he sees this, and I think that this, combined with kind of the teachings of his father, are really the basis of why he doesn't stick to the let's do what's best for the leading class of New Yorkers. Let's do what's best for the common man.
All right. So he rises up through New York politics, and then he is going to make the shift to national politics. And he's going to become Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President McKinley in 1897. So can you talk about how he comes to hold this role of Assistant Secretary of the Navy and the significance of this very short period of time that he has the role, the significance of that part of his life to where he eventually is going to end up as president?
Yeah, so in 1882, Theodore Roosevelt publishes the book, the Naval War of 1812, and this is really kind of the definitive work for the Navy, naval history of 1812, and it kind of puts him on the radar. And so you see him, rise to the office, go to Washington, become part of the Assistant Secretary of Navy. And then during his time, he's advocating for America's Navy is not what it is today. I mean, we are the world's sea power. We have the most amount of aircraft carriers with the most amount of military armament on the seas. But at that time, we were lucky if we had, enough to be able to defend our own borders. And so he really advocates to help grow the Navy, and to the point where he's actually often thought of as, the kind of the second father to the United States Navy, in his advocacy of increasing the investment in the growth of the fleet. Ultimately, what happens is the USS Maine, there's an explosion on board in Cuba, and this essentially starts America's involvement in the Spanish-American War. And Theodore Roosevelt resigns his commission and immediately signs up to join the Rough Riders.
Yeah, so let's segue into the Rough Riders. So what were the Rough Riders? What was his role in the Rough Riders, and how did Theodore Roosevelt's time leading the Rough Riders in Cuba during the Spanish-American War further cement this kind of masculine persona that helped him become governor of New York and then later vice president and president?
Yeah, the Rough Riders, this is perhaps the most iconic of Theodore Roosevelt's stories. So the kind of a little bit of background history here is his father did not serve during the Civil War. There was this opportunity to essentially pay to have someone serve on your behalf. So as Theodore Roosevelt's growing up, and he's entering those first kind of years of politics, and he's interacting with people, he's running into Civil War veterans all the time. And he has, or people who have had people who had relatives who served in the Civil War. And his family doesn't have that. And, at the time, this kind of turn of the century, that was kind of a little bit of a slight to not have done that civic duty, to done that manliness thing of going to war. And so the opportunity to fight within a war was always one that I think he sought out. Now, he obviously came from politics, and he has not got that military background, and so he joins, he essentially forms the first U.S. Volunteer Cavalry Regiment, along with Colonel Leonard Wood, and they're gathering these people of all walks of life, right? Everything from elitist individuals in New York to American Indians to your common man, and they're all form this cavalry unit. It's a ragtag kind of interesting group of people. They go to San Antonio. They begin to kind of practice and kind of learn the techniques of working together as a military unit, and then ultimately they're headed to Cuba. Now, this is a cavalry unit. They get to kind of to where they're supposed to ship off, and this is his work as the Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Navy. There's not enough room on the ship to even send the unit. He kind of works through the back scenes here to with kind of a press in tow to advocate that his unit needs to be prioritized on the ship. They can't, however, take their horses. Only he and the officers are allowed to take their horses as part of this. And they get to Cuba, and this is the first time he's seen any type of action where he's being shot at, and leading men, and really he rises to the occasion. I think other men might have suddenly get overwhelmed, and certainly you see that in successive wars in World War One, but he really he runs and leads a victory, and ultimately he's got his famous charge up Kettle Hill, and where he's able to kind of help turn some of the tide there, and Now, of course, he does all this with kind of press in tow, and so this is kind of his way of being able to continue that story of him, and the press is very fascinated by the unit. Ultimately, when he comes back, he will write a book about it as well, and and he becomes, when he decides that he's going to run for office, he runs for office with his Rough Riders uniform, which is, by the way, a uniform that he created at a Brooks Brothers, right? So, I mean, this is, just kind of a very fascinating way to kind of become a war hero. But it's one that's, I think, very well deserved by his leadership and of the unit, and the efforts that he did to take on the task.
Yeah, so you obviously touched on this in your response there when you talked about him wearing his Rough Riders uniform, his Brooks Brothers Rough Riders uniform, when he was running for office after the conclusion of the Spanish-American War. But can you talk a little bit more about how those experiences that he had in Cuba in the war, how that helped pave the way for him to become governor of New York pretty quickly after that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's kind of the stories and the tells. I mean, he's so well known out of this because of his work with journalists. People are following this unit, this unit that is just fascinating, made up of just very interesting people and different walks in life and background. It's almost kind of a microcosm of what America is. You know, he's it's been so kind of amazing in all of the efforts that he does, uh, and how successful they are, that message really kind of carries and resonates with the American people, and he capitalizes on that. And so when he's running for governor of New York, this is something where people are more aware of him. They know who he is, right? And they know that not only is he now a war hero, but of course he also has all of the great elements that of his time as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, as well as as the police commissioner in New York, as his time in the Civil Service Commission, and as his time as in the New York Assembly as well. So.
All right, so he's able to use all of those experiences, including his status as a war hero, to become governor of New York. But then he's not governor of New York for that long, and eventually he gets put on the Republican presidential ticket with William McKinley in the election of 1900, since McKinley's first vice president, Garrett Hobart, died in office in November of 1899. How would you describe Roosevelt's brief tenure as governor of New York, and what was it about his tenure as governor of New York and the political situation at the time that led to him being on the ticket with McKinley in 1900, when Hobart's death necessitated the selection of a new running mate for McKinley?
Yeah, I think, as governor, he learns a lot about kind of the economic issues, the political techniques. These are things that helps inform him. He very much looks into, trusts, monopolies, labor relations, as kind of his kind of major things. It's it's kind of where he develops the rules for the square deal. He's also using the press. So he holds twice daily press conferences, which is, I know, something that's common today as you look at the White House, but that's a very unique thing during his time. And this enables him to kind of connect to that middle class connect base. He successfully, pushes the Ford franchise bill, which tax public franchises granted by the state, controlled by corporations, and so he's doing all these things in kind of the interest of the people, and which makes him a very popular governor, but it also kind of puts a little bit of a target on his back, right? That kind of somewhat corrupt New York State political world is looking to see, well, how can we just kind of get him out of the way, right? And so, as the opportunity to fill that role as vice president, they're like, well, we've got a really great person that can be on the ticket, and so, how do we essentially they promote Roosevelt's name. Now, he has no desire really to be vice president whatsoever. I mean, this is a role that he sees as not one of any great power. And I think you'll see most vice presidents feel that way. I mean, John Adams was a perfect example of someone who didn't like that role to begin with. But it's an opportunity for him, and so, he does go on the ticket, and sure enough, wins. And then this is and now he's in the vice president role in the highest roles of the nation.
Yeah, and let's talk about that because he's not in that vice president role for very long. The McKinley Roosevelt ticket wins, and they get inaugurated in March, as presidential inaugurations used to be in March. Get inaugurated in March of 1901. And then 6 months later, we're in September of 1901, and William McKinley is assassinated by Leon Czolgosz in Buffalo. So it is a very brief period of time during which Teddy Roosevelt is the vice president. What happens during those 6 months? Is there anything notable about his vice presidency, or because it was so short-lived, is there not much that's notable? And really, the notable nature of his time in that environment begins with the assassination of his predecessor as president.
Yeah, there's not really a whole lot, as you described. I mean, it's kind of the campaign. He gets a lot of activity. He does over 480 stops in 23 states. So this is kind of setting up his ability to travel the country and to meet with the common man. So that is definitely part of that election campaign. But even during his time, as vice president, there's really he kind of he presides over the Senate for just kind of 4 days before it's adjourned. There's not really much going on. And in fact, when McKinley is shot, he's in Vermont on vacation hiking, and so they actually have to go and find him to be able to come back and be sworn in as president. So.
All right, I want to spend the bulk of our remaining time together talking about his actual time as president. But before we do, can you just describe what was the reaction like when McKinley was assassinated? I think a lot of Americans have a sense of how the country reacted when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated and when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. But with the other two presidential assassinations, Garfield and McKinley, it's almost like those are asterisks in American history or footnotes. They're not really discussed to the same degree. So how did the country react when McKinley was assassinated and Roosevelt becomes the new president?
Yeah, you're right. We obviously very common today to know those types of more prominent assassinations. I mean, I think the mood of the country is that it's very divided. And this is what kind of is leading to this is just that severe division, and the inability to kind of unify people. You just have this kind of class differences, and that strays into political differences and strife. And so but yet it's still a horrific element that kind of rocks the nation at the time too. You of course remember too is that Theodore Roosevelt nearly gets assassinated later in his life too, and so it does kind of give you the dynamics of what the politics and were during the day, and the challenges with that, and very scary moments in our history, but also when President Lincoln was shot, it was a real good question whether the country was going to be able to stay together, right? And so we're seeing at least the continuation of the of our systems of government with assassination, but certainly a horrific thing. And I don't think that Theodore Roosevelt was quite ready to become president, but he rises to the occasion. So.
Right. Well, ready or not, he ended up in that position. So let's dive into the almost 8 years that he spent
Oh my
as
gosh, yes.
president. And earlier you described him as the first modern president. You've already discussed some of his focus on protecting the rights of the common man. You briefly mentioned the square deal earlier, but can you just kind of give an overview of his presidency? What are some of the things that made him the first modern president? What were some of his key policies? What were some of the key things he was focused on? And then there will be several of those areas that we'll discuss in more detail here in a few minutes.
Yeah, well, you got to take yourself back, to his era, and this is really kind of industrial revolution, right? So big factories are now being able to change the way that people work, that change the way that goods are produced. He is looking at he's looking at it. These corporations are they don't really care about the worker, right? They care about producing and producing economies, right? And so there is no regulation for the working conditions that you should. There's no regulation for the number of hours you should work. There's no regulation about who should be working. And as an individual, as your general worker, you are kind of left to the devices of where you sit in the world, right? And so I think that this is something that he sees, right? It's something that he obviously saw during his time as governor. It's just things that he saw, during his time in New York, and I think that these items play to it. So, the square deal really is about, breaking up these major corporations that have gained control over multiple industries. And so, he is aggressively using the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act to be able to break up, monopolies, breaking up Standard Oil and regulating Standard Oil, the Northern Securities Company. These are elements that he goes after. He's, continually he negotiates coal strikes. Kind of one of the first times I think a president that even gets into kind of labor disputes one-on-one. He goes after in his conservation effort, any type of corruption, any type of land use things where there's government assets that are being used. He's going after that. He regulates under the Pure Food and Drug Act. Just the how the labels and preservatives and chemicals are used in production of food, which kind of all comes out of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which is published in 1906. To really help drive this this effort. Also, the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, very similar in this as well. Railroads, railroad rates were very high. There's a lot of effort to consolidate those, and he uses gives power to the Interstate Commerce Commission to be able to better regulate those and make it more reasonable. And of course, you can't kind of forget, all of his conservation efforts as well. He establishes 5 national parks, 150 national forests, 51 bird reserves, 4 game preserves, right? So he really is the father of the U.S. Forest Service, the father of what will become the National Park Service, right? And through all the efforts that he does with his legislation. And then, he's constantly dipping into foreign policy in different ways, right? He wins the Nobel Peace Prize for his help negotiating the Japanese Russia conflict. He is looking into, you know, the efforts in Latin America and with the helps steer right the Panama Canal. So there's really a lot that you know, that he's doing during his presidency, a lot that he gets done, and it's not necessarily all party line one way or the other, right? It's really what's doing right and best for the American public, and that's all defined in his square deal.
Yeah, and let's dive into some of these in a little more detail. You did an outstanding job of providing an overview and touched on most of the key points that I wanted to bring up. But let's dive into these with a little more specifics, a little more meat on the bone. And the trust busting aspect is where I want to start, because that is as much a part of his reputation and his persona as the cowboy adventurer masculinity pieces are. Roosevelt is thought of as this trust buster. His opposition to the Standard Oil Trust that you cited earlier is very much associated with his time in the White House. But can you talk a little bit more about just how significant the policy changes were in that area? And then if there are any statistics you can provide, anything that can demonstrate just how different he was in his opposition to trusts from McKinley and his other predecessors in the Oval Office.
Yeah, I think the largest thing about it is that Roosevelt sees trust as really what he defines bad trusts, which are ones that restrain trade uh, and charge unfair prices, and they're doing this really at not increasing the nation's GDP, right? You know, so it's by not having competition, it actually is hurting America. That's really the way that he sees this, and so really, I think um, there was he ultimately brings 44 antitrust suits during his time, and just as kind of a comparison, uh, the the three kind of presidents before him in combined had only prosecuted 18 antitrust violations. So you're right. This really is one of the defining issues of his presidency.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you cite the three presidents before him, because that would include Benjamin Harrison, who was in the White House when the Sherman Antitrust Act was ratified, or when that was passed and signed into law, I should say. So we're including the person who was in the Oval Office when the Sherman Antitrust Act comes into law, plus the two people who immediately followed that individual. And yet Roosevelt's use of antitrust suits dwarfs what those three people combined did. So it really is a notable part of his legacy for sure.
Mhm.
All right. So when you gave your overview earlier, you talked about his regulation of railroads, use of the Interstate Commerce Commission. You also talked about the Pure Food and Drug Act and the influence that Upton Sinclair's The Jungle had on this. I previously did an episode on the history of Chicago, so listeners will have a little bit of familiarity with the meatpacking industry in Chicago and Upton Sinclair's The Jungle and the role that played at the time. But can you go into a little more detail in those two areas, the regulation of railroads from Teddy Roosevelt's White House, as well as the Pure Food and Drug Act, the establishment of the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and just how significant of a change policy-wise he and his administration made in those areas?
Yeah, well, so as I mentioned with the railroads, a lot of the merchants were complaining the railroads rates were too high. So the ability to ship your goods, you know, was just very expensive. And that's really because there was this kind of overall monopoly of you know, barons who controlled multiple railroads. They had just continued to buy up railroads across the country because when it was first formed, railroads were not a unified system, right? They were not ones that, and you kind of could contract with each, and there were sometimes even competing lines that ran to the same different places. But as that starts to consolidate, as that starts to all come together, you know, then there's the ability to raise rates. And I think those barons got a little bit too greedy, right? And so he, in the 1906 Hepburn Act, this is where he gives the Interstate Commerce Commission the ability to regulate those rates. And it was a fight, within Congress to be able to pass the legislation, but ultimately they were able to make a compromise with this and create what Roosevelt believed was reasonable maximum rates. And then this, really enables them to. It also kind of grants the same capabilities to be able to look into other fees as well. So it's kind of that set element to help, how do we set rates for things that go with to drive interstate commerce, which ultimately drives the American economy.
All right. And then on the foreign policy side of things, you mentioned the construction of the Panama Canal. Of course, Panama as a country didn't exist until this time period. It was previously a part of Colombia, and it was separated from Colombia around this time. You also mentioned his winning a Nobel Peace Prize for brokering the end of the Russo-Japanese War, something that I don't think you mentioned in your overview, but the Great White Fleet and the demonstration of American naval power was another key aspect of Roosevelt's foreign policy. Can you go into a little more detail on the foreign policy side of things, some of the key events, key aspects, defining characteristics of Roosevelt's foreign policy vision during his nearly 8 years in the White House?
Yeah, well, he sees America as responsible for, showing our strength across the world, right? The kind of famous adage, speak softly but carry a big stick, right? The threat of warfare, right, is enough to be a deterrent. But peace obviously is good. It drives economies, and you see kind of that balance in what he's always trying to play. His advocacy for, increasing the might of the U.S. Navy and it is really to be able to demonstrate that America has the ability to become a superpower. We can be a might for the world. And, in a place where, countries would go to war with them, and it would be mostly land wars, right? The U.S. Navy gives an ability for us, and still today gives us the ability to be anywhere in the world, right? And to be able to fight and enter territories. And so he does this demonstration of the Great White Fleet, where he does a tour around the world of this kind of newly constructed Navy, and to demonstrate that America is going to be ready and a superpower. It's all kind of demonstrations of this. The Panama Canal kind of plays into this, right? So, before you'd have to travel around the Horn of South America there to be able to get from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic or vice versa. But the Panama Canal really allows you to cut that tremendously down. Not only mention the fact that winter storms around the Arctic is really difficult to navigate, and so there's Roosevelt's kind of effort in this. There's a lot of corruption with the Panama Canal and company, and a lot, there was elements that just kind of was making the project really difficult. And so Roosevelt essentially helps to, establish the treaty, which then does efforts. He actually goes down there. There's a very famous photo of him, in the bulldozer, kind of doing the work, press doing the work, and he ultimately kind of gets this built, and it enables passage of this, and it's a naval strategic advantage for the United States as well, to be able to have this ability and control, really, of this ability to move quickly from one ocean to the other.
Well, and we also see the development of the Roosevelt Corollary during his presidency. If we go back to when John Quincy Adams was Secretary of State under James Monroe in the 1820s, the establishment of the Monroe Doctrine, more or less, is saying that Europeans are not to intervene and interfere in the affairs in the Americas and internal affairs in the Americas. And then Roosevelt adds his own kind of amendment to that with the Roosevelt Corollary that says the U.S. can get involved in internal affairs in other parts of the Americas under certain circumstances, and that ties in with a lot of the specific examples connected to Roosevelt's foreign policy that we've looked at so far.
That's right. Yes.
If you're an aspiring podcaster, then joining Podcasters Paradise is an absolute must. Podcasters Paradise is a premium membership community that will help you create, grow, and monetize your podcast. With step-by-step video tutorials, resources, and templates, and daily support via the private Facebook group, Podcasters Paradise is the best place to learn how to be a successful podcaster. Joining Podcasters Paradise has helped me with my podcast in so many ways. It is truly a tremendous resource. Plus, as an added bonus, if you join Podcasters Paradise through my link, then after you launch your podcast, I will mention on my show and link to your podcast from placesandprofiles.com, as long as your podcast is not inappropriate and is not significantly opposed to my beliefs and values. Check out Podcasters Paradise and get started on your podcasting journey today by going to placesandprofiles.com/paradise. Again, that's placesandprofiles.com/paradise. One thing that I want to mention very briefly, and this is certainly not something that would come up in the minds of most historians who are studying Roosevelt's presidency, but maybe it's just a piece of amusement on my own end. But we've talked about with the Roosevelt administration establishing greater regulations connected to the meatpacking industry and establishing the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and greater regulation over the railroads. One area where Roosevelt had an interest in getting involved and changing the rules of the game is in college football.
Yes.
And in the early 1900s, football was focused at the collegiate level. The NFL didn't exist, and it was a very dangerous game. And because of the spate of deaths that sadly had happened on the football field during games, Roosevelt wanted to get involved in changing the game, changing the rules of football, standardizing the rules across college football to try to minimize the deaths and the gruesome injuries that were occurring. So just a very different sort of personality, a very different sort of outlook on the presidency, and a very different sort of administration than what had pre-existed him in the White House.
Yeah, that's one of the stories that I think very, very few people kind of know, is his effort to influence football, right? And the safety of football. It was a very brutal kind of game, and so what he kind of does is he convenes a meeting. He summons representatives from Harvard, Princeton, Yale to the White House, and he kind of forms a governing body, which he forms the Intercollegiate Athletic Association in the United States, which later becomes the NCAA. And so they're responsible for overseeing the safety in the sport. And he's responsible for the introduction of the forward pass. Which helps to spread out the play and reduce the number of violent pileups, and the also kind of stricter penalties for rougher play. So it's really kind of he really gets very active in so many things.
He definitely does. All right, so his presidency ends in 1909, and he's succeeded by a fellow Republican who's a protege of his, William Howard Taft. And his relationship with Taft, of course, is going to sour in the ensuing years to the point that Roosevelt challenges him for the Republican nomination in 1912 and then runs a third-party campaign, Progressive Party, Bull Moose Party ticket against Taft and against Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson. Can you talk a little bit about his relationship with his successor as president, with William Howard Taft, and how this went from being a mentor-mentee sort of relationship into a relationship that saw Roosevelt challenging Taft during his reelection campaign?
Yeah, well, so they were very close friends. Taft served in Roosevelt's administration as Secretary of the War, and he was one of Theodore Roosevelt's most trusted advisors. And he was also, like-minded progressive kind of, and so that this was something that made them bond and be very close. So when he then succeeds Roosevelt, and this is where the kind of rift begins. So while Taft continued some of Roosevelt's progressive policies, he kind of had a different approach and temperament, um, and it was a little less, kind of aggressive and a little bit more aligned with business interests, and not aggressive enough against continuing the antitrust and conservation efforts that Theodore Roosevelt had championed during his time. But really kind of the breaking point really is when Theodore Roosevelt kind of decides to run against him in the 1912 election, and forming the Bull Moose Party, where he splits the Republican vote. And so this, just as any, when you talk to other presidents that have had a split vote, and this is always a very challenge with this. But ultimately, eventually they do kind of rekindle some of their friendship later in life. But that 1912 election really is kind of the thing that drives a huge stake in between them.
Well, and the 1912 election also sees an assassination attempt on Theodore Roosevelt, which is something that you referenced earlier. So can you talk about that incident, what brought about the assassination attempt, and the influence that had on Roosevelt after the assassination attempt?
Yeah, so it's October 14th, 1912. He's arriving at a campaign event in Milwaukee, and he gets shot. He's about, and essentially what happens is the bullet is lodged in his chest after penetrating his steel eyeglass case, which really is something that he carried with him really since he served in the Rough Riders, and as well as his 50-page thick folded copy of his speech. And so, perhaps his long-windedness is what saved him. But he, instead of running away and going to the hospital, and he goes in and begins to deliver his speech. And the blood is kind of pouring down him. He gives a 90-minute speech, which is just absolutely, one of those most incredible things. And he starts it off with saying, "Well, I've been shot," right? So it's a big audible gasp, but it's his speech, "The progressive cause greater than any individual," is perhaps one of his most iconic ones, and carrying in it the ideals of the Bull Moose Party. And I think it is really just one of those kind of superhero moments of Theodore Roosevelt where, there's just nothing going to stop him.
Well, and another speech of his, of course, that's iconic is his Man in the Arena speech. So can you talk about that speech, what sorts of things were in it, and why that speech has become so significant?
Yeah, well, so it is really, one of his most profound thing. It's the profound works. It's the one that the most people know about, and it's the one that's most quoted. It's one that I think has a lot of resonance today. And so it's I'm going to actually just kind of pull it up here, if you mind, and I am going to make some quotes from it, because this is just kind of something that everybody should kind of see and hear today.
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
Pardon me, just real quick, but get that up.
Yeah, no, I'm glad that you're finding quotes for this speech because it really is so significant to the way that we view Roosevelt today, and there's a lot in that speech that is very much connected with his legacy and the larger message and picture he was trying to get across.
Yeah, so he writes in it, probably the most kind of iconic quote of it is, "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or how the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs or comes short again and again, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be those cold, timid souls, neither no victory nor defeat." And what Roosevelt's really saying here is you cannot make change unless you try, right? And so I think that this is you have to be in the arena, you have to be involved. And I think this not only extends to our leaders today, but also citizens, right? You have to play an active role in your democracy. You have to be one that is constantly worrying about what's going on in your community, what's going on in Washington, what's going on in your state. Stay active, be active, volunteer within your community, volunteer to do things. Um, and and if you don't try, you can't do, right? But failure is still an okay option as long as you did the effort and put in the work. And I think it's one of the things, it's perhaps his most famous quote. It's the thing that he's most known for, and I think it really just describes his personality really well, and kind of who he really was, and the ideals that he lived up to.
Absolutely. A couple of loose ends that I want to get to before we wrap up this interview. With a lot of presidents, one of the defining characteristics, in a way, is their spouse and the first lady, as well as the first family, their kids. You haven't really talked about that aspect of Roosevelt's presidency and of Roosevelt's life. What should we know about his spouses, as it ended up being, and his children?
Yeah, well, he Roosevelt is a family man, and that's absolutely, core to who he is. He marries in 1880 Alice Hathaway Lee. They have a daughter, Alice Roosevelt, and it, his time with her is very short. So she on February 14th, Valentine's Day, both she and his mother passed away in uh, the same house in New York City, and he's just absolutely devastated to this. He writes in his journal, he puts a big, large X on the page, and he says, "The light has gone out in my life." Um, this is where he goes out to the Badlands in North Dakota. He becomes a rancher. He experiences what kind of that cowboy life is, and the toughness of living in the frontier. And he writes that actually his time in North Dakota is one of the things that makes him tough, and it makes him defines who he becomes as president. But ultimately he gets back into the arena, and in 1886 he marries his childhood friend, Edith Kermit Carroll, and they have, she serves really as his advisor to many things. Their time, they spent time together in Washington, D.C. when he was working in the Civil Service Commission. She was with him when he became a war hero during the Spanish-American War, when he served as governor, vice president, and ultimately president. And so he's his trusted confidant, and she serves as a tremendous first lady who is active in the social scene in Washington, D.C., and was active in kind of working to bring people together. And I think and his children around him were very essential too. I mean, it was just kind of a really wonderful scene, I think, in the White House to have so many young children, around it during that time, and kind of very different from what most of us see the White House today.
Sure. Now, to finish up the last little bit of Roosevelt's life, 1912, he runs for president, as we talked about, on a third-party ticket with the Progressive Party or the Bull Moose Party. Finishes second, which is a rarity for third-party candidates, to say the least. But he does not win that race. Woodrow Wilson becomes president. He does not return to the White House. And then some 7 years or so later, in 1919, he ultimately passes away at the age of 60. What should we know about Roosevelt's brief period of time, those 7 years between his unsuccessful 1912 bid and his untimely passing in 1919?
Yeah, well, he retreats to Sagamore Hill, but he also goes on adventures. I mean, this is where he is. He goes to the Amazon. He goes to Africa. I mean, he's an individual that's traveled the world here, but his sons have entered World War I, and that he's advocating to the Wilson administration to not be so timid on joining the war, and so this is something that he's kind of always kind of a little bit frustrated, but he turns to speeches. He turns to ways of kind of his own writing as a way to kind of be able to stay in the arena, and to stay active, and ultimately that he's continuing kind of doing this until later in his life, but during this time, he's also an advocate for the League of Nations. He is an advocate, for opposing kind of the timid response that Wilson has, and he's he's helping to also look in and with kind of the elections and different things that are happening. So he's still staying active during this time as well.
All right. So to kind of put a bow onto Roosevelt's legacy almost, historians, a lot of historians anyways, they generally hold his presidency in high regard. Whenever there are rankings done of presidents, he generally scores pretty well in those. He's included on Mount Rushmore, of course, within a couple of decades, within a few decades of his passing. So is there anything about the way the historians view Roosevelt or anything else about his legacy that you think is important to understand as in trying to understand this man and his significance?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you just look at his entire life, all the things that he's accomplished, right? I mean, today we've just kind of rushed on the high level. We've done the Cliff Notes version of this, and I highly encourage people to read biographies about him and to learn more about his different points of life. And because you'll find a lot of similarities, I think, with what we're going to through today as a country, and there's a lot of learning from this. I would say that there is always a need to kind of continue to do more research, and that's why we're building this presidential library, is to help to his papers are at Harvard, they're at the Library of Congress. We've got a great partnership with Dickinson State University in North Dakota, and really the aim here is to bring all these together to be able to kind of build a digital library that makes research easier to do, and can be a pilgrimage for people that want to learn more about TR. And I think that this is it's an exciting project that I'm very excited to be a part of. But I think it's also going to be an exciting project for the country to be able to see that we unveil on the nation's 250th anniversary that where you can come and you can learn more about his life, and get interested, get in and kind of see how you fit into the arena as well. And so we're just very excited about the opportunity, and I think that TR's legacy is one that we all should try to strive to live up to in our own lives, and take inspiration. And that's really the efforts of what we're trying to do today.
Well, it's certainly a fascinating and interesting project. So I wish you the best of luck with that. Before we conclude our conversation for today, do you have any favorite Theodore Roosevelt stories that we haven't touched on so far that you think would be interesting for the listeners and the viewers to hear?
That's a very good question. Hmm. Uh, it kind of comes in when you kind of here's probably the one of the more interesting ones that I think is a little less known, is that when he was younger, he's gathering specimens, from around the world of animals and bugs and different things like that, and he's doing this within his own room. And they joke that he actually, his room was kind of a museum to this, and these collections actually get donated to the museum in New York, and so he's always kind of doing these interesting things even as a young child. And so I think that there's various different stories like that if you get into one of his biographies, you're going to really be able to kind of get better sense and dive into topics that are just fascinating. So he's a man of many traits, a man of many very interesting stories, and so I would encourage all Americans to kind of learn more about him.
All right, and I obviously mentioned the library's website at the beginning of the show, but if you could mention the website again, what people might find there, any resources, readings, links, anything that you would recommend someone check out if they're interested in learning more about either the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library or the man Theodore Roosevelt himself.
Yeah, so go to trlibrary.com, and you can find all links to all of our social media. You can follow us on there, where we share both updates on the project to build the presidential library, as well as a lot of history and things that were happening on his day on the social media. You'll want to sign up for our email newsletter too, because that's another place that we send out information. And look for more to come. Our partnership with the Dickinson State University is going to be able to, and the TR Center there is going to enable us to be able to share a lot more details about his life, and bring a lot more capabilities to the library. So in the next coming years, you'll see that partnership with us and other institutions grow even more.
All right. Well, it sounds great. It sounds very exciting. I want to remind everybody that the show notes page for today's episode is placesandprofiles.com/27. Placesandprofiles.com/27 is the place to go. So that's where we'll have links to related episodes, to resources that Matt has mentioned, to anything that has come up over the course of our conversation. So placesandprofiles.com/27. And Matt, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I want to wish you the best of luck with this project. Certainly a fascinating individual, a very American individual, a unique character that in a lot of ways is uniquely American, but certainly played a significant role in the development of the U.S. Over the decades, and kind of furthered the persona and the character that is associated with the United States. So definitely a fascinating individual, and a beautiful part of the country as well that you're in, with the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library in North Dakota. I went to the Theodore Roosevelt National Park a few years ago, and it is just stunningly beautiful. So to have a presidential library in rural North Dakota near the town of Medora, next to the national park, is going to be a fantastic experience for so many visitors. And thank you so much for your time. Best of luck with everything that you're working on there for a fascinating man in a beautiful part of the country.
Well, thank you, Adam. It's really great to be with you. And yes, I encourage everybody to come check out the project and join us in North Dakota when we open in 2026. And thank you for sharing and spreading the word about TR.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Places and Profiles podcast. Please visit placesandprofiles.com to subscribe and listen to more episodes. Come back again soon, and thanks for listening.